Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story tonight is a startling claim by U.S. intelligence that Russia offered bounties to Taliban fighters for killing U.S. and British troops in Afghanistan. Let's get right to it. The story was broken by a U.S. newspaper, the New York Times. The Times has claimed that the Russian military intelligence unit, GRU, offered cash rewards to Taliban fighters to kill U.S. and British soldiers in Afghanistan. The paper also claimed that President Donald Trump and Vice President Pence were briefed about this development sometime in March. The White House press secretary says the paper is wrong about the briefing, though she did not deny the veracity of the story or that U.S. officials have known about this for months. My statement does not speak to the merit of the alleged intelligence, but to the inaccuracy of the New York Times story. Ms. McNaney said, the story, which has been picked up by newspapers and news channels widely, has been branded as a fabrication by Russia's foreign ministry. Let's get to our experts to see what juice, if any, does this report have. We are joined tonight by Matthew Bryza, who's a former U.S. ambassador, and Mark Sleboda, who is an analyst and international affairs and security expert, especially as far as NATO is concerned. Let me begin with Ambassador Bryza here. Ambassador Bryza, what do you think of this report? It has also been rubbished by the Taliban, and they have said that they have absolutely no reason to do this, and this is a fabrication.
It's certainly the type of thing that the GRU routinely does. I mean, it uses dirty tricks, and I wouldn't be surprised if they went after U.S. soldiers. What the Taliban said when it rubbished the report, however, wasn't, at least the way I read it, that the report was untrue. But instead, they said we don't need to be directed on how to manage our own affairs by another country. So it strikes me as plausible. The Washington Post has just reported this morning further information that apparently some U.S. soldiers died as a result. We know that over the course of the last couple of years, a small number of American soldiers have perished either through hostile gunfire or improvised explosive devices in Afghanistan. Only like 10 in 2018 and another 14 or so in 2019, and then 2 this year. So the numbers are low. But if this is true, I mean, President Trump is going to have to take some sort of what counts as decisive diplomatic action, at least.
Pastor Bryza, what exactly would Russia gain from this? I mean, there's got to be some political or strategic objective behind something like this, or is it just simply the satisfaction of seeing U.S. and British troops die?
I wouldn't discount that latter motivation too much. I mean, from Moscow's perspective, a lot of Soviet troops perished back during the Afghan War in the 79 into the 80s, thanks to U.S. operations or the U.S. provision of Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, as I recall, that groups, who came into being like the Taliban later, used against Russian soldiers. So the settling of scores. It may also be on a more strategic level that Russia is not in favor of the peace agreement holding between the Taliban and the U.S. In my area of work, in the South Caucasus, where I've been a conflict mediator, or had been for a long time, it was always my feeling that Russia did not want to resolve any of these conflicts. Even when I had a Russian counterpart as my negotiating partner, I felt that they always wanted to keep the pot stirred, wanted to keep the parties off balance a bit, so that they had more leverage, more cards they could play, and could maintain their influence wherever that conflict was ensuing. And that may be the case in Afghanistan as well.
Okay, Ambassador Bryza, stay. I'm quickly going to go to Mark Sleboda and then get back to you. Mr. Sleboda, Russia has these motivations. They want to keep the parties off guard and off balance. And this report, as Ambassador Bryza said, the more details coming in with reference to this report. Also, the fact that the GRU is known to indulge in such operations.
Well, certainly all intelligence agencies around the world are occasionally known to indulge in such activities. No less the CIA with their support of jihadists in Syria and so on. And the former director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, recently saying, we lie, we cheat, we steal. That's what we do. We have entire training courses on it. So, I mean, that is neither here nor there, though. Russia has no motivation to do this. Russia has actually long been supportive of the U.S. invasion and military occupation of Afghanistan going back to 2001. They provided logistical support. They provided intelligence support. Special forces were reportedly on the ground helping Northern Alliance, which Russia had long supported for decades, cooperate with the United States. They became the essential de facto ground forces and the nucleus of the government that the U.S. installed in Afghanistan. Russia has provided air corridors for the U.S. to be in Afghanistan, and they even provided logistical support with temporary bases on the ground in Russia. To help U.S. supply their forces in Afghanistan. So this idea that Russia is somehow motivated now after all these years, if the threat of terrorism from the Taliban and other jihadists in Afghanistan to their own borders and their Central Asian allies is really just nonsense. I think we have to regard this. It's been dismissed by the Director of National Intelligence, punching holes in the New York Times story. It's been completely debunked by the Taliban itself, who were very specific that it was false and that they need no incentive to kill U.S. occupation forces in what they see as their country, and that they have always done so with their own resources. And they regard it as besmirchment, the idea that they would cooperate with foreign intelligence agencies.
Okay. Right.
Even the
Mr. Sloboda, I've got the thrust. I've got the thrust of your argument. So let me go back to Ambassador Bryza. Mr. Bryza, these are some solid arguments with reference to how Russia supported the U.S. invasion, also gave them the corridor for supplies and the rest of it, the northern, line of communication, as it was called. So why now? This is an important question. And while I agree with you, and actually Mark Sloboda also does, that intelligence agencies do all sorts of cloak and dagger stuff. Why now? I mean, what exactly would be the motivation?
Well, we don't know when these attacks would have taken place, right? All we know is that a report has come out. But, the killings, if they occur, we don't know. But if they had, it could have been any time, in the last few years. Remember, I said how many U.S. soldiers had been killed in 2018. There were only 10. 2019, there were another 14. So not sure when it happened. But what strikes me, is President Trump's reaction, to be quite honest. Or the White House's reaction. If this report really surfaced, how could President Trump not have been briefed? I mean, I spent 4 years in the White House. If a report came into me, let's say I was the Russia person, which I worked on for a long time, saying that Russian intelligence operatives were killing U.S. troops, I would have lost my job if I didn't get that to the Oval Office as quickly as possible. That would be reckless behavior by a White House staffer. So if the report exists, if President Trump really was not briefed on it, why would that be? And that would probably be because the climate in the White House is not to bring bad news about Russia to President Trump. And if that's the climate, then that raises deep questions about the dysfunctionality of the White House, which we hear a lot about. Ambassador Bolton's book tells us a lot about that. But it's really problematic in terms of whether or not President Trump has any notion of strategic vision for the United States and for confronting Russia, where it actually is quite aggressive in places against U.S. interests, let's say in Syria.
Now, that's a very important that you brought up, Ambassador Bryza, because that then goes much beyond just this particular aspect that we were talking about. Then that goes to the White House's approach to Russia and, in its entirety, which is a much bigger ballgame.
And it's becoming quite a big issue in this upcoming presidential campaign. In the United States, President Trump is viewed with suspicion, not just by Democrats, but by a lot of Republicans and my former colleagues in government, because he's been so strangely accommodating to President Putin. President Trump likes to say, as he did this weekend, no U.S. president has been tougher on Russia. And to be fair to President Trump, he has, in fact, allowed Ukraine and Georgia to purchase some defensive weapons that even President Bush wouldn't allow while Russia was invading Georgia. Russia still occupies Georgia, of course, as we know. So he's been tough on some measures, but for some strange reason, he seems to have an affinity for Vladimir Putin, and on several occasions has said, well, I trust when Vladimir Putin says he didn't do something, even if my intelligence agencies say he did. That's bizarre for a U.S. president to behave that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. Could it be that this is some kind of, personable sort of approach to President Putin, while, of course, taking care of the larger U.S. interests, as you said, that he has indeed been tough on Russia in some ways. So could it be that we are conflating the way he personally approaches President Putin, but also the way he structurally, in terms of policy, approaches Russia?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Haidar. I think that President Trump, just for some reason, likes the strong leader, Vladimir Putin, like he likes the strong leader, Recep Tayyip Erdogan here in Turkey, where I live. He likes Bolsonaro in Brazil. Those are the types of leaders that Trump admires and wants to be like them. It's just, you can't behave the way they do in a democracy because they behave undemocratically very often. And you actually need a concept, a strategic concept for how to deal with Russia, which I don't see President Trump having. I see him lurching from one side to the other, but always wanting to keep President Putin close, to the extent, let's say, of wanting to invite Russia back into the G8, whereas all the rest of the G7 is saying, no, that's impossible. But to please President Putin, President Trump wants to bring Russia back into the G8. So I think you're exactly right. He tries to separate the two, President Trump does, but he does not succeed in doing so always.
Could it be, a final question, Ambassador Bryza, could it be that, quite apart from the fact that, yes, he does like strongmen, and that's a problem in and of itself, but could it be that he actually thinks, for whatever reason, that by having personal relations with other heads of government or states, that he could further U.S. interests or push those policy measures that would not be possible if only the Sherpas were working on them?
Certainly, yeah, certainly. And 2 points I'd like to make on that one. One, every American president in my lifetime, when he has first come into office, has thought he was the one who's going to have the breakthrough agreement with either the Soviets or the Russians, number one. Number two, President Trump believes, he has a magical personality. His famous book, The Art of the Deal, he believes one-on-one with a leader of any country, he has these charms that are able to persuade the other leader to go along with U.S. objectives. And most famously, Kim Jong-un in North Korea is an example of that, where they exchanged some letters that were almost expressing love for each other. And in the end, everybody who knew anything about North Korea knew there wasn't going to be any comprehensive nuclear agreement. But President Trump was convinced he could get Kim Jong-un there and to do something that's against the North Korean Constitution, which is give up the nuclear weapons, only because President Trump thinks he can close a deal because he's a charming person.
Yeah, well, indeed it's true, except that international relations structurally are so complex. But thank you so much, as always. That was Ambassador Matthew Bryza speaking with us. Mr. Sloboda, the floor is yours. You heard him, and let's see what you have to say in relation to President Trump's approach to Russia, his liking of President Putin, how Russia is becoming an important issue in the upcoming U.S. elections, and the rest of it.
Yeah, certainly. It's no secret that President Trump directly campaigned on and was elected on a foreign policy platform of trying to improve relations with Russia, in part to try to split the growing Russia-Chinese alliance. That's probably his geopolitical motivations. But he was elected on this. However, there's always been a very powerful segment of the U.S. blob, as Ben Rhodes called it, the foreign policy establishment, and the deep state, the unelected national security bureaucracy, that have been very much against a lot of Trump's foreign policy initiatives, improving relations with Russia, withdrawing troops from Syria, withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, a peace settlement with North Korea, and so on. And I think they have actively acted quite often through these anonymous former and current officials, often in intelligence branches, leaking stories, which many of which have proven later to be untrue or impossible to verify. And I think this is another such instance. And I think the former ambassador is a perfect example of this. And we see that this is from the U.S. side, that this is more than likely an example of internecine U.S. domestic politics, once again using a certain segment, using Russia as a bogeyman to try to attack President Trump domestically going into an election, to try to paint him as soft on Russia or traitorous to the country, and so on. And there's been a long cycle of this with Russiagate, and a lot of former intelligence claims coming out of that about his relations with Russia, British intelligence involved in that with the dodgy dossier Steele report, and none of it was able to be substantiated by the Mueller investigation. We have zero evidence to go on in this latest story. We've got denials across the board on the nature of the reporting, from the Director of National Intelligence to the spokesman of the U.S. National Security Council to Russia to the Taliban. And I think we have enough of a history that we have to demand a higher degree of proof from anonymous intelligence officials speak to journalists that have done nothing to verify this story on the ground in Afghanistan with the supposed Islamists and criminals that were interrogated that are the basis for these claims. We know there's been a lot of torture. We know that a lot of innocent people in Afghanistan were turned in by U.S. allied forces in Afghanistan and falsely imprisoned in Guantanamo Bay for years, decades even. So I think the burden of proof is on the journalists that created this story, that broke this story. And I think that anyone that automatically trusts anonymous U.S. intelligence officials in such a situation is really playing into the hands of a very, very bitter and cynical U.S. domestic political struggle.
Right. That was very eloquent, Mr. Sloboda. Thank you so much for speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the ASEAN leaders' statement about China's activities in the South China Sea. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. We move on to our next story tonight. At the ASEAN Annual Summit on Saturday, leaders of the 10-nation bloc cited the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea as the basis for the rights of countries to the world's oceans. The convention also demarcates stretches of waters called exclusive economic zones, where coastal states are given the right to exclusively tap fishery and fuel and other resources. ASEAN officials say the statement is very significant in view of China's claim to the South China Sea and Beijing's naval activities there. Analysts regard the area a potential flashpoint of conflict between the United States and People's Republic of China. The ASEAN statement also stresses, and I quote, that UN Convention on the Law of the Sea sets out the legal framework within which all activities in the oceans and seas must be carried out. Global Times, a paper that voices China's official position, said in a leader that outsiders are inflaming South China Sea squabbles. Let me quote straight from the Global Times leader. China hopes to conclude the negotiations with ASEAN members on the Code on Conduct in the South China Sea by 2021. This benchmark for a 3-year program was set in 2019 and is now in its second year of negotiations. Indeed, this year is crucial to the talks for resolving many core interests of the parties. It is rational that ASEAN members intend to maintain their claims and defend their interests in the upcoming talks with China. The stronger assertion in the latest statement reflects the intent of these parties. Vietnam seems to be making the most claims. By virtue of being ASEAN's rotating chairmanship this year, Hanoi may entice other countries to try and maximize their interest in the COC talks with Beijing, unquote. Let's dive right at the deep end here. We are joined by Professor Elizabeth Laris, who is a professor of political science and international affairs at University of Mary, Washington. And we are also joined by Andrew K.P. Leung, who is a strategist on China at Andrew Leung International Consultants. Thank you to both panelists. Let me begin with Professor Laris here. Professor Laris, give me a sense of what you think of the ASEAN statement. And I also quoted from the Global Times leader a couple of experts in terms of why the statement has come out, because China thinks that the ASEAN countries are trying to sort of, position themselves for tougher negotiations.
The declaration is interesting for the fact that it is a group declaration. Almost exactly 4 years ago at this time, ASEAN member states met with their Chinese counterpart in Southwest China and actually had come up with a similar type of declaration, but then acted it just hours later under pressure from China. China would like to deal with the various parties, the members of ASEAN individually. And so China has always wanted to deal with them bilaterally, that is one-on-one.
Okay, so given that there is, as I mentioned, the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which also creates the EECs. Now, if all parties, I'm assuming, if all parties are signatories to this, which they are, then what exactly is the problem here, and why is the ASEAN bloc concerned about Chinese moves in South China Sea?
Yes, according to the 1982 UN Convention on Law of the Sea, UN clause, so just let's call it Law of the Sea, that no country can claim the entire South China Sea. No country can claim jurisdiction over the entire South China Sea, that is, over all the maritime structures and the waters of the South China Sea. China is claiming it has traditional rights, historical rights is probably a better term, historical rights to the entire South China Sea. And they use some old maps, and they have something that's called the 9-dash line. Yeah. And that the perimeter of the 9-dash line, runs from approximately Taiwan, past the Philippines, down to Brunei, Malaysia, and Vietnam. So if you could picture that huge body of water, China says it has jurisdiction over that entire area. Now, China says it's willing, of course, to share the resources there and do scientific cooperation with the other 5 claimants of the South China Sea. But what Vietnam in particular, Taiwan, Philippines has seen is that China has, forcibly blocked, let's say, Filipino, Vietnamese fishermen from getting to what's called their EECs. According to the law of the sea, countries can claim 200 miles off of their sovereign territory as their exclusive economic zone. So that is, they have exclusive right to the minerals, the riches of the sea there, but they can also allow other countries to use it. And according to the law of the sea, countries can claim 12 miles off of their coast as their sovereign territory. Now, what China has been doing is building artificial islands, engaging in land reclamation, and then declaring maritime structures as their sovereign territory. Again, according to the law of the sea, only maritime structures that are above water at high tide and are able to sustain life, that is, have some freshwater source, are considered to be islands. So what China is doing when it reclaims islands, it builds up islands and then claims it as its territory, that violates the law of the sea, because they have been artificially built up so that at high tide they are above water. So the other claimants take exception to this, as does the United States. and again, according to the law of the sea, does not recognize these as China's territory. So as China builds up the territory and claims these maritime structures as islands, then it claims it can have 12 miles off of those islands as a sovereign territory, 200 miles off as its exclusive economic zone. The problem is when China does that, those EEZs overlap Philippines, Brunei, Malaysia, Taiwan's existing EEZs. So then the question is, okay, who gets the rights to those resources? And EEZs overlap throughout the oceans, and the law of the sea says that needs to be worked out in peaceful ways. But what Vietnam in particular is saying, and some of the other claimants, is that China has been using very aggressive, using military, using its Coast Guard, its armed armada to force its claims in violation of the 1982 law of the sea.
Okay, stay with Professor Laris. Let me pull in Andrew K.P. Leung here. Mr. Leung, is this China's Monroe Doctrine?
Well, I think the South China Sea, apart from all the historical claims and the legal provisions under the law of the sea, the South China Sea is an important, well, I wouldn't even use the word important, it's a crucial, almost an existential kind of conduit for China's economic blood. In terms of trade, in terms of importation of raw materials, and which sustain the Chinese economy, which of course supports the legitimacy of the regime. So I think the South China Sea is much more than just territorial sovereignty, which in itself, of course, is very sensitive to China. Of course, China relies on the historical claims, but at the end of the day, the United States is exercising so-called freedom of navigation exercises. But this amounts to almost a ritual in the sense that there is no question of freedom of navigation there because, as I said, the South China Sea is China's lifeblood. And it would be in China's existential interest to ensure that there's freedom of passage for the ships, which supply China's economic lifeblood. And there is neither any question of safety because China has not threatened the navigation of any kind of commercial vessels. But on the other hand, territorial disputes is a highly sensitive issue, both to China and to all the Southeast Asian countries. Now, as far as the ASEAN is concerned, China has been on very good diplomatic relationship with the ASEAN countries. And in fact, the so-called Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the world's largest trading bloc, the free trade agreement is set to be signed sometime within the next 12 months, cementing the economic relationship with ASEAN countries. Now, the ASEAN countries don't want to succumb to China's dominance. And but they do not want to be forced to choose sides. So I think the question about the sovereignty is going to continue. But I think that with the improving relationship, diplomatic relationship between China and all the Southeast Asian countries, I think they will find a way to set aside some of the differences and perhaps to explore avenues for cooperation. For example, the management of the resources, especially the fisheries, because the fisheries are in South China Sea is subject to all sorts of challenges. So joint management of ecological resources, perhaps even joint exploration of resources and setting aside some of the territorial disputes for a while. But I think at the end of the day, China is effectively in control. Because, as I said, it's China's economic lifeblood. It's unlikely to take very lightly the challenge that there should be a blockade by some hostile powers, and China would be powerless to do that. So I think that China is now building military installations in some of the islands. In fact, if you can see within the so-called 9-dash line, apart from any kind of sovereignty disputes, occupation is 9 points of the law. But that works for China as well as it works for the other claimants. For example, Vietnam and Singapore and Philippines have been occupying some of the islands claimed by China.
Mr. Leung, the problem here is that in July 2016, the International Arbitration Tribunal invalidated China's vast historical claims to the waters based on the Convention on the Law of the Sea. China, of course, as you know, refused to participate in the case and dismissed the ruling as a sham. Also, China has transformed 7 disputed reefs into missile-protected island bases, including 3 with military-grade runways. Now, these are signals that obviously will make the ASEAN countries pretty wary of what China intends to do, because it amounts to A, not entirely agreeing with a legal normative approach, as in the case of the tribunal, and also flexing the military muscle.
As far as the law of the sea is concerned, let's not forget that the Philippines took the matter all the way to the to an international tribunal. But of course, China refused to take part in the tribunal. But what the tribunal did, and also make clear in its verdict, is that the verdict is not on sovereignty. It's only on the claim of about the 200 miles, whether it's an island or there's some kind of features and so on and so forth. It is specifically stated in the International Tribunal. That's not a past judgment on sovereignty, but a past judgment
that wasn't the remit. Because I think that wasn't the remit of the tribunal, which is why they didn't look into that. That wasn't part of their jurisdiction.
Well, I think that the ASEAN countries don't want to go to war with China on that. As I said, the diplomatic relationship amongst all the countries in the world, perhaps, is most cordial as far as China is concerned. And also, as I said, ASEAN is about to sign the regional comprehensive economic partnership with China within the next 12 months. So I think that somehow this question of sovereignty is unlikely to be resolved because no country can just give in on sovereignty. But I think that with the improving relationship between China and the ASEAN countries, and the ASEAN countries don't want to be forced to choose sides between China and the United States. So I think that the chances are that there could be some point of accommodation on both sides, starting with developing the code of conduct in the South China Sea.
Yes, that COC that I talked about. Stay with me, Mr. Leung. Let me go back to Professor Laris here. Professor Laris, one of the arguments on the Chinese side is with reference to US's repeated interference in the region, which China thinks is likely to be the reason for ramping up ASEAN's confidence in strengthening its assertion over the South China Sea. Now, would you agree with that assessment?
No, I do not agree. The United States has been the dominant maritime power in the Asia Pacific since the end of World War II. The United States behavior has been very consistent in the Asia Pacific. We have, through the U.S. Navy, based the 7th Fleet, is at Yokohama, and we have sizable naval presence throughout East Asia. And in that presence, we have been able to maintain freedom of the seas. And that is something that actually goes back to the Versailles Treaty.
But as Mr. Leung said, China hasn't. But Mr. Leung's argument was that China hasn't threatened commercial, tankers and ships. As far as the SLOC is concerned, that's secure.
Yeah, that's true for now. But what the other countries are seeing is that China also promised that it would not militarize the so-called islands that it's built up, and it's been very aggressive, against Filipino and Vietnamese fishermen. And so, yes, it's true. China's not going to block its own trade. But, for the countries there, the South China Sea is as much a lifeline for them as it is for China. okay, so let's say it's China's backyard. Well, the South China Sea is the ASEAN's front yard. And so they need access to the riches and the resources in the region as well, which gets us back to the issues of, the EEZs. And that was the primary issue, of course, that the Philippines brought to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, is that China was muscling in on the Philippines' EEZ. And it's interesting that China did not accept the decision that went against China back in 2016, and China turned around and reclaimed that it had historic rights to the region. Well, when China signed UNCLOS, it gave up its historical claims. And so China is using international law when it wants to, for example, when it sues countries and companies and, for patent violations.
Professor Laris, that's the problem with all states that are powerful. I mean, the U.S. has done this, other powerful states do this, Russia does this. And, as a professor of political science and international affairs, you're very aware of how that works. But thank you so much for your time. Let me, before I wrap up, quickly go back to Mr. Leung here. Mr. Leung, how do you see this unfold? Very quickly, because I have very little time.
Well, as the professor said, of course, the encroachment of other special exclusive economic zone on both sides is going to be taken very seriously. But I think that this kind of overlapping exclusive economic zones does not apply to all the ASEAN countries. It only applies to some, considering the huge size of the South China Sea. It's a vast expanse of the ocean. But I think the likelihood is that both sides, both the ASEAN individual countries and China, are unlikely to concede their sovereignty or their claim of the so-called exclusive economic zone. But bearing in mind that freedom of navigation is not threatened, and neither freedom or safety of the passage of normal shipping. But I think the chances are that with improving diplomatic relationship between the ASEAN countries and China, and of course the ASEAN countries don't want to be forced to choose sides between the United States and China. I think the chances are that they were going to look at how the code of conduct could be further strengthened, and also the possibilities of maybe joint exploration or joint management of ecological resources, or joint exploration of some sort of energy or gas or other resources in the South China Sea.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Andrew K.P. Leung speaking with us. This is all from In Focus. Wait, we shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.